Swan in the 70s is being tasked to remote view the moon by people who have access to these photographs. So I'm thinking
And
they
Carl
want
Wolf
him.
died a mysterious death after he.
Exactly. So by the way, Carl Wolf, and this is horrible. These, you know, so I mean, what are we discussing? Disclosure and how disclosure could be manipulated. Well, just before this wave of so-called disclosure began, in 2017, 2018, poor Carl Wolf was run over just the way John Mack was run over, And I hardly think it's a coincidence because he would definitely have been one of the people subpoenaed to testify.
Mm-hmm.
And what Carl Wolf had to say is something that whoever's gatekeeping this whole disclosure business does not want out there in the public.
Mm.
In any case, Ingo Swan in the 1970s, when he was remote viewing what was on the moon, was dealing with people who had access to these photographs, and I think what they wanted was for him to snoop around on the ground, as it were, get a ground's eye view of this city on the dark side of the moon. And here's what he saw there. He saw tall Nordic people, statuesque Nordic people, who gave him a look like, you don't belong here, get the fuck out of here and don't come back. And he saw these same people lording over basically armies of slave laborers who he said were naked, meaning that they're probably under some kind of a dome that we can't see, transparent dome or something. And they were living in these like ramshackle, like makeshift shelters under appalling conditions, conducting slave labor on the moon. Swan also remote viewed Mars in the early 80s. And he said these same people who he had seen on the moon were responsible for a civilization, the ruins of which he viewed on Mars. There were very large, like honeycombed cities, which he said showed evidence of explosions, internal explosions. He said he had the impression that a battle had taken place there.
Well, it's funny you say that. There's a PhD physics who's, I think he worked at Sandia or Los Alamos and also Lawrence Livermore. His name is John Brandenburg. And he says that xenon-129 and argon-40 exist in excess of what you would ever expect just from natural radioactive isotope decay. And that proves that there was actually some nuclear holocaust on Mars.
Well, they found a large amount of xenon-129, which is the product of two things, supernova explosions and hydrogen bomb explosions.
Mm.
And we know there was no supernova on Mars. If there was, there wouldn't be a solar system here.
And you said there was one other argon?
There was when you irradiate rocks that have potassium in them, and all rocks do, they produce a isotope called argon-40, and that's super abundant on Mars. So you have two things that are products of what look like an intense nuclear reaction on Mars in the atmosphere.
Yeah, I spent several days with Dr. Brandenburg in New Mexico, and I put this in Closer Encounters, this research of Dr. Brandenburg, that basically the deviation from normal of the isotopic ratio of xenon-129 in Cydonia specifically, where we have photographic evidence of ruins on Mars, the xenon-129 isotopic signature at Cydonia, he has discovered, is only matched by thermonuclear test sites on the Earth. It's the only other place in the solar system where we see that kind of signature. And he came to that conclusion when he was working at Sandia Labs, which is where nuclear weapons research takes place in the United States. Okay, so there's evidence that some kind of a nuclear confrontation took place on Mars. And by the way,
and Carl Sagan called him and said, "Hey John, why are you causing so much trouble?"
Yeah.
I found that very interesting. Carl Sagan, who held definitely security clearances and knew more than
I'm pretty convinced Sagan was a member of Majestic.
That would make sense to me. Yeah. Because he sort of flipped to he was very interested in UFOs. We know, earnestly interested growing up. His mentor, he would have debates,
the book he wrote was Shklovsky, the Soviet scientist. He co-wrote Intelligent Life in the Universe. And Sagan himself at that point was saying, we should look at ancient myths and check the archaeological and historical record for contact and so on and so forth.
There you go.
And then all of a sudden...
And he had a security clearance, I think project, was it A119, I think in the late 50s. where they were considering nuking the moon as a show of force against the Soviets. And he had a security clearance through the Air Force through that. And then it was interesting. He sort of flipped into anti-UFO mode and like almost official priestly citadel spokesman of the American scientific community, right as J. Allen Hynek moved from, rationalizing, explaining everything away via Project Blue Book, the official Air Force fake program, into more openness. So
Yep.
like it was like kind of late 60s, early
Yep.
70s. It's kind of this interesting kind of, thing.
And he was the right age by that point to be recruited into such an organization, In any case, Brandenburg came to the conclusion that something like an Empire State building's worth of nuclear weapons had been detonated to produce that kind of a deviation of xenon-129 isotope at Cydonia. But so Swan saw evidence of this on the ground, okay, like a devastated civilization. And he said it was the same people who he saw on the moon as basically slave drivers. Now, unbeknownst to Swan, and by the way, when Swan remote viewed Mars, he worked with a team of, I believe, 5 other remote viewers, and they were all, they did it independently, right? And they're all blind to the target. But unbeknownst to that whole team led by Ingo Swan, in 1984, I think it was the same year, in 1984, Joe McMoneagle at the Monroe Institute did a remote viewing of Mars for the CIA. And
really? I thought it was in the 90s.
No,
really?
1984.
1984.
Yeah, go look it up. The paper's available now. It's been declassified. Wow. You can read the whole report.
Yeah.
It's been declassified by the CIA.
Yeah.
And it's 1984. I believe the title is Mars 1 million BC.
Yeah.
And because initially they say to him, go to Mars like 1 million BC. That's what's in the envelope, right? But what he said to them was, when McMoneagle wound up there, he said, oh, it's all in ruins. It's there were people once here. I see like ghosts of people who once were, but they're not here anymore.
I saw people who were 12 to 14 feet tall.
So then yes. So they said to him, okay, well, if it's devastated and the people aren't around anymore, go back to when they were around. Mm-hmm. Now, he never reports on how far back that was. He just goes mentally to when they still had a civilization.
So they go back to 1 million and there's some recent ruins, and then he goes back further.
Exactly.
And he sees the people.
Exactly. Now,
okay.
These people are the same again as Swan saw. Very tall, sort of Nordic people, very broad-shouldered people, not an ounce of body fat. They're wearing these skin-tight clothes, that reveal every contour of every muscle. And he says some very interesting things about their worldview, their outlook, and their dying civilization. But what's most interesting is this. He says that a group of them were sent out in a craft to go scout out a new world that they could possibly develop as a habitation for themselves, because Mars was no longer a planet on which they could survive, right? And this scout ship runs into a planet where there are constant electrical storms. There's a tremendous amount of volcanic activity. It's the opposite of Mars, but in a way that's also difficult to support human life. In other words, it's overgrown with vegetation, right? It's an incredibly volatile but living planet. And they're like, we can't live in this planet under these conditions. We would have to modify this planet to live there. And so I suspect that what's going on there is the scouting out of a primordial Earth by people from Mars. Which then brings us to the question of the moon, and what the moon is, right? I mean, so we've got Carl Wolf telling us there's a city on the dark side of the moon. We've got Ingo Swan having done remote viewing that confirms that. But I think that the situation with the moon is actually a lot more disturbing than there simply being, a city-sized alien base on the backside of the base on the backside of the moon. You look at the geometry and the mathematics of the moon in relation to the Earth and the sun, it makes no sense. The moon is 1/400th the distance between the Earth and the sun, and it's 1/400th the size of the sun. And so that creates these perfect eclipses that we see, right? That by itself is very odd. And then you look at the fact that the craters on the moon are all only a few miles deep. You never find a crater on the moon that's more than 5 or 6 miles deep. But some of these craters are like 186 miles wide, right? So, and at the base of the largest craters, you see a convex surface. In other words, it looks nothing like the Grand Canyon or the Valles Marineris on Mars, where an asteroid would hit it and you'd see a deep gouge that should be proportionally as deep as it is wide. No. What you're seeing, apparently, is a hard shell that's being revealed through the impact against the regolith by whatever object. The ejecta is going 186 miles out in every direction, but there's never a crater deeper than a few miles, and what's being revealed there at the crater base is a hard convex surface. Then there's the impact. One of them was a test, one of them was accidental. The first one, I think part of an Apollo lander hit the moon, and there was a seismograph that had already been positioned there, and it registered basically the seismic signature that you would face if you were measuring a hollow object. That basically the reverberations went down for about 20 miles, and then they stop. And the way that the reverberation was distributed throughout the moon suggested that, as the observers, put it, it rang like a bell. And so then they repeated this test deliberately a second time. I think it was in Apollo 13. And this time they hit it with a more significant impact, and this kind of seismic signature was observed for 3 hours, the moon basically ringing like a hollow object for 3 hours. So there's all this evidence that the moon is an artificial satellite. And setting this in the context of Joe McMoneagle's remote viewing of Mars, what I argue in Closer Encounters is that the people on Mars probably constructed the moon for two purposes. One, as a very large-scale transport of a significant population from Mars to the orbit of the Earth. And two, as a terraforming device to radically alter the ecological situation of the planet so as to make it habitable for humans, right? They said there were these horrendous constant electrical storms and volcanic eruptions and so on and so forth. Well, the Earth spun a lot faster before if the moon had not been in orbit at some point, we would have been dealing with a planet that was a lot more unstable, spinning much faster, prone to toppling over. The moon acts as a tremendous stabilizer for the Earth. By the way, that's another thing about the moon, is that it has a unusually stable orbit as compared to the moons around other planets, as if there's a stabilizer inside of it. So I think it was created to transport a large population, and it was used as a terraforming device. Now, to answer your deeper question, what does that say about who these people are, right? Number one, it says that they're people. So NHI is not an appropriate appellation for these individuals, right? They look like us, particularly they look Nordic, and they appear to have been the progenitors of the human race. Not only that, they appear to have terraformed the Earth to make it habitable for humanoids. But I have one huge problem with all of that. The time scales. It makes no sense whatsoever to me that you would have people who look like us, I don't know, millions of years BC on Mars. The same people are basically, I don't know, involved in the power struggle that's been remembered as the myth of the Atlantean Revolt. The same people are being encountered today by, let's say, Travis Walton. When Walton was abducted, first he had to deal with these grays, these little robotic entities that, tried to put him back together after he, sustained some kind of physical damage being thrown by the, electrogravitic repulsion of the craft. But then he, big strapping fellow that he was, he broke free of the control of these robots, and the medical facility or whatever went down the hallway, and he bumped into these Nordics. And from there on, he was handled by these people. He said they looked like they could all have been members of the same family.
I went into another room where there was a chair. There was some kind of a projection or some kind of a viewing thing in this room where you could see a map of the stars. A man came in while I was trying to find a way out there. And this was a human-looking person. They had passed in a crowd, this individual, and on Earth. He was bigger than me, taller, and more muscular, a very large individual. I went up and tried to talk to this guy, and he didn't answer me. He led me outside of this craft that I was in, which was apparently parked inside of a large room or a building or a larger craft, and led me out of this room into another room where some other beings like himself put me unconscious. When I regained consciousness, I found myself laying on the roadway, and I saw a craft hovering there that just sat there for a second and just shot straight up. That's the last I've seen of him.